A calm sea, clear skies. Then, without warning, an Allied convoy disappears. No storm, no enemy in sight, only silence and confusion spreading across the Atlantic. Was nature itself turning against them, or had someone learned how to control? The weather forecast in the middle of World War II? In September 1943, Allied weather stations across the North Atlantic began reporting data that made no sense. Storm warnings appeared in regions where the sky was clear. Convoys at sea were hit by violent winds that no forecast had predicted. The errors were not random. They were exact, repeating, and targeted at routes vital to the Allied war effort. Lieutenant Andrew Frost was among the first to notice. A civilian forecaster before the war, he had joined the Army Air Forces to bring scientific precision to weather prediction. His post on Greenland's coast was small but critical. Every chart he sent shaped decisions made in London and Washington. Yet, his instruments now betrayed him. Pressure readings dropped while skies stayed calm. Radio transmissions reported storms forming in areas that should have been stable. Frost rechecked every instrument, every cable, every barometer. Nothing was wrong with the equipment. The data itself seemed to be lying. Across the Atlantic, Allied ships began to vanish in sudden tempests that appeared out of nowhere. Reconnaissance aircraft sent back photographs of open sea, where men swore there had been thunder and waves. Commanders blamed faulty forecasts. Meteorologists blamed local anomalies. But none of them could explain how the same impossible weather kept returning to the same shipping lanes. Weather was the unseen backbone of Allied planning. Every convoy, every bombing run, every movement of men or supplies depended on it. And with the invasion of Europe still in preparation, accuracy had become a matter of strategy as much as science. If nature could no longer be predicted, entire operations would collapse. Frost compared his Greenland records with those from Iceland, Newfoundland, and Scotland. The pattern became clearer each day. The false reports did not form along natural storm paths. They aligned with Allied supply routes, precisely where uncertainty could cause the greatest disruption. By mid-September, Frost had documented 3 convoys that changed course because of false forecasts. 2 reached port late. 1 never arrived. Yet the weather in those regions remained calm throughout the period. He began to suspect the problem was not meteorology at all. It was communication. The Arctic network transmitted coded weather summaries by radio to Allied commands. Each station used assigned frequencies. Frost noticed faint distortions buried in the static, tiny fluctuations, too regular to be natural. When plotted over time, they formed a rhythm. Someone was inserting information into the transmissions. At first, he assumed it was technical interference from distant stations. But as more convoys were misled, the scale grew impossible to ignore. Entire routes were shifting on the basis of weather that did not exist. Frost reported his findings to Allied headquarters, warning that the interference might be deliberate. His memo received little attention. The idea that weather reports could be weaponized sounded absurd, yet the losses continued. British analysts noted that the false forecasts always favored German naval movements. U-boats appeared where Allied ships expected calm seas. Supplies bound for Britain were delayed by warnings of phantom storms. Confidence in meteorological intelligence began to erode. For Frost, the situation became personal. His name was attached to forecasts others no longer trusted. He spent sleepless nights reviewing transmission logs, comparing every signal with his handwritten notes. Each comparison confirmed the same unsettling truth. Data was being altered somewhere between the Arctic and London. He could not identify how. The codes remained correct, the signal strength normal, but the content arriving at command centers was not what he had sent. Barometric values, wind directions, and pressure fronts were subtly different, enough to mislead, never enough to expose a clear forgery. It was the work of someone who understood both meteorology and deception. Frost's unease turned to dread when reports arrived from the North Atlantic convoys. Commanders began to doubt their own navigators. Some delayed departures until conditions could be verified. Others sailed despite warnings and faced real storms after assuming the alerts were false. The balance between caution and confidence had broken. By late September, Frost compiled a map of all reported anomalies. The pattern pointed north, toward the Arctic islands under partial German control. The evidence suggested that enemy forces were not changing the weather, but changing what the Allies believed about it. It was a new form of warfare, invisible, technical, and psychological. By corrupting information at its source, the enemy could paralyze decision-making across oceans. Frost had no proof, but his instincts were clear. If the deception continued, no operation relying on weather intelligence could be trusted. And if the coming Allied invasion of Europe depended on forecasts, that deception could alter history. What began as a scientific puzzle had become a military crisis. The weather itself was no longer the enemy. The war was now being fought inside the data. While Allied analysts struggled to explain the phantom storms, the truth of their origin lay far to the east, in a cold and isolated facility on the Norwegian coast. It was there that Germany had built one of its most secret operations, an effort to seize control of the skies not through aircraft or weapons, but through information. The program was called Wetterflugdienst Nord, the Northern Weather Flight Service. On paper, it was a meteorological research project. In reality, it was a weapon of psychological warfare. The operation was directed by Dr. Wilhelm Decker, a meteorologist whose name appeared in few official records. Decker had once been a respected scientist, a man who believed in the neutrality of weather, a force beyond human manipulation. But by 1943, his work had become a tool of the state. Germany's access to Atlantic weather data had been cut off as the Allies tightened their control over sea routes. To plan U-boat patrols and long-range air missions, they needed accurate forecasts. Without them, their military power would weaken. Decker's assignment was simple in theory, but revolutionary in design: create a network that could both collect and manipulate weather information. German engineers established hidden meteorological outposts across the Arctic and the North Atlantic, on the coasts of Norway, on uninhabited islands near Greenland, and even on drifting ice. Some stations operated automatically, powered by batteries and sending coded reports by radio. Others were manned by small teams of scientists and soldiers, isolated for months in the frozen wilderness. The goal was twofold. First, to gather real-time atmospheric data for German operations, and second, to intercept and corrupt Allied weather transmissions. By sending false reports through overlapping frequencies, the Germans hoped to introduce doubt into Allied forecasting systems. Decker's innovation was subtle. Instead of replacing genuine data with false readings, his stations began to broadcast a blend of both: accurate information interlaced with minute errors in pressure, temperature, and wind direction. The changes were small, often undetectable, but their effect multiplied across the network. Within weeks, Allied meteorological maps began to contradict themselves. To the Allied observer, it looked like nature had become unstable. To the Germans, it meant chaos was working in their favor. From his base near Tromsø, Decker directed teams operating under extreme secrecy. Each transmission followed strict patterns, designed to mimic Allied signal behavior. He knew that too much interference would expose the deception, so he calibrated his system with precision. A single incorrect digit could alter an entire forecast, but only if inserted where the Allies trusted it most. He was not a man of ideology. Those close to him later described his manner as detached, almost clinical. He followed orders, but his notebooks revealed growing discomfort. Weather, he once wrote, is the last neutral field. To weaponize it is to declare war on truth itself. Yet, he continued, his superiors demanded faster results. The High Command believed that if the Allies lost confidence in their weather services, convoy schedules would falter. Ships would depart too early or too late. Supplies would fail to reach Britain in time. Even the timing of future invasions could be disrupted. For the first time in history, the outcome of war might hinge not on gunfire, but on invisible waves of radio and air pressure. In late 1943, a new phase of the project began. Decker authorized the installation of automated transmitters capable of replaying recorded forecasts in Allied code formats. These devices, disguised as standard meteorological equipment, could operate unattended for months. They broadcast false storm warnings across Allied frequencies, perfectly timed to appear credible. German intelligence monitored the results carefully. Reports from Naval Command confirmed that Allied convoys were indeed changing routes. The deception worked, but Decker's satisfaction was mixed with unease. He knew the danger of success. If the system became too effective, the enemy would start to question everything. And once suspicion replaced trust, even true information would lose its power. He often wondered if his adversaries, those unknown meteorologists across the ocean, were beginning to sense the pattern. Somewhere, someone was probably watching the same anomalies he had created, trying to make sense of them. Still, the program grew. Weather reconnaissance flights, known as Wetterflüge, took off from occupied airfields, crossing the North Atlantic to record genuine data. Their reports were mixed with deceptive signals and rebroadcast through the Arctic network. It was a perfect illusion, truth disguised as confusion. From a military standpoint, the strategy was elegant. It required no confrontation, no visible aggression. The weapon was mistrust itself. The enemy would make their own mistakes, guided by the very systems they had built to protect themselves. In Berlin, the operation was praised as a triumph of scientific warfare. But Decker saw the darker implications. He knew that the boundaries between science and manipulation were dissolving. Each day, his transmissions erased a little more of the line between reality and fiction. The results soon exceeded expectations. Allied convoy reports showed signs of panic. Ships delayed departure even when no storms existed. Commanders began to rely more on instinct than on forecasts. The deception had reached its psychological target, the human mind. Yet within his private logs, Decker began to note inconsistencies. Some of his stations were picking up echoes, reflections of signals that seemed to come back distorted, as if someone was studying them, maybe even tracing their origin. He could not confirm it, but he sensed the enemy was listening. By winter, German intelligence was celebrating its invisible campaign. They called it Wetterkrieg, the weather war. But for Decker, the name carried no pride. He saw the cost in another way. If weather could be used to deceive, then no information could ever again be trusted without proof. The German advantage would not last forever. The more they tampered with data, the more attention they drew. Somewhere in the Allied network, analysts were connecting the dots, and among them was a man named Andrew Frost, whose persistence would soon expose the first trace of Decker's phantom empire. For now, though, the deception held. Invisible, precise, and devastating, it drifted across the Atlantic airwaves, an unseen storm of information, designed to turn human certainty into confusion. It was the hidden war above the clouds, and it had only just begun. By the beginning of 1944, the mystery that had started in the Arctic outposts reached the attention of Allied High Command. The phantom storms were no longer isolated incidents. They had become a consistent threat, disrupting convoys, delaying supply lines, and straining confidence across the Atlantic. The enemy was unseen, but its effects were measurable. Lieutenant Andrew Frost arrived in England after being recalled from Greenland. His work had drawn attention in London, where senior intelligence officers needed answers. The War Office had received growing complaints from naval commanders who no longer trusted their weather reports. Too many forecasts had failed without reason. Too many ships had been lost to weather that should never have existed. At the Combined Operations Headquarters, Frost met Major Ruth Brennan, an officer who specialized in unconventional warfare. Her background was not meteorology but intelligence analysis. She was known for seeing patterns where others saw coincidence. Within hours of reviewing Frost's data, she recognized something he had missed. The false weather transmissions were not random errors. They followed a precise geographic sequence. Every interference point was aligned with known German-controlled regions in the north. The broadcasts occurred in overlapping cycles, as though someone was coordinating them with calculated timing. Frost's charts, pinned to the walls of a London basement room, formed a web of connections across the Atlantic. It was the first visual proof that the distortion was deliberate. Together, Frost and Brennan reconstructed the timeline of the disruptions. The first false signals had appeared after Germany lost its major Atlantic weather ships in 1942. The pattern intensified the following year, when remote German stations in the Arctic were established. Each new station coincided with a spike in transmission anomalies. They began cross-checking Allied radio logs with captured German communication records. The findings were alarming. Some of the false reports were broadcast using frequencies identical to Allied ones, complete with authentic encryption headers. That meant the enemy had not only intercepted the weather network, they had learned how to imitate it. The implications went beyond meteorology. If false weather data could reach Allied convoys undetected, then any form of strategic communication was at risk. The deception was not meant to destroy ships directly. It was meant to erode trust in the very systems that coordinated the war. Brennan summarized it in one sentence during her briefing. They are not trying to change the weather. They are trying to change what we believe about it. As Frost continued to study the corrupted data, he noticed that every false forecast shared a small but consistent discrepancy. Pressure values deviated by the same fraction, regardless of location. It was too systematic to be natural. When plotted on a grid, those deviations created a triangular pattern pointing northward toward the Norwegian coast. The source was no longer invisible, but finding the origin was only part of the problem. Even if they could locate the hidden transmitters, stopping them without alerting the Germans would be almost impossible. Brennan proposed a cautious approach. Let the deception continue, while quietly gathering evidence of how it worked. To expose it too soon might drive the enemy to develop a more sophisticated version. For the next several weeks, Frost and Brennan operated as part of a small intelligence cell under Naval Command. Their task was to trace each false weather signal back to its origin point using triangulation. The method was slow and complex, requiring cooperation from outposts across Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands. The data arrived in fragments, coded, and incomplete. But gradually, the map began to fill in. The results pointed to at least 5 German stations operating across the Arctic, some automated, others manned. Each station seemed to follow a specific mission: to disrupt weather data during key Allied operations. The purpose was clear: psychological paralysis. The consequences were already visible. In late 1943, a supply convoy to North Africa had been delayed after forecasts warned of a massive storm. The storm never came. The delay caused critical shortages at the front. In another instance, a convoy sailed early to avoid what was thought to be false warnings, and encountered a genuine gale that scattered its formation. No gunfire, no visible enemy, yet the damage was real. In intelligence circles, this form of interference began to be called invisible warfare. It relied not on physical destruction, but on confusion and hesitation. Once commanders began doubting their information, even accurate forecasts became suspect. The growing mistrust reached the highest levels of Allied planning. With the invasion of Europe under discussion, the ability to predict and trust weather data was vital. Every operation, from troop transport to air cover, depended on precise timing. If Germany could compromise that trust, they could cripple the invasion before it began. Brennan saw the larger picture. She understood that the weather war was not just about storms, it was about perception. The Germans were attacking confidence itself. If the Allies could no longer trust their own systems, their superiority in technology and planning would mean little. Frost's reports soon reached the Joint Intelligence Committee. His findings confirmed that the interference originated from specific northern coordinates, many within range of known German-controlled territories. Yet there was still no official acknowledgement of the threat. Some commanders dismissed it as technical coincidence. Others feared publicizing it would cause panic within the ranks. Behind closed doors, however, new strategies began to take shape. The Allies would need not only to counter the false signals, but to understand their origin and method. Frost's persistence had turned a mystery into a measurable enemy action. What remained was to find a way to turn that knowledge into advantage. The pressure on him grew daily. Every error in a forecast was now examined for signs of deception. Every delay or loss was traced back to weather intelligence. Frost felt the weight of each failure personally. But Brennan reminded him of a deeper truth. The purpose of psychological warfare was not to defeat through destruction. It was to make the enemy destroy themselves through doubt. The Germans had used science to spread confusion. The Allies would now use analysis to expose it. By February 1944, Frost's work had become classified under a new category: counter-meteorological operations. His findings would lay the foundation for a plan that no one had ever attempted before. A counterstrike conducted through the same invisible airwaves that had once deceived them. For the first time, the Allies began to understand the scope of the hidden war above the clouds. What started as phantom storms had evolved into a full-scale battle for control of truth itself. As the scale of the deception grew, its human impact began to unfold across the Allied war effort. The manipulation of weather data did not simply confuse strategists, it reshaped lives and altered outcomes thousands of miles away from the source. In March 1944, a convoy known as Meridian was preparing to depart from Liverpool, carrying critical medical supplies for Allied troops in North Africa. The ships were scheduled to sail under clear skies, based on verified weather charts. Hours before departure, a revised forecast arrived through the usual communication channels. It warned of a sudden storm forming along their route. The message bore all the correct codes and signatures. The senior naval officer delayed departure, assuming the alert came from headquarters. The next morning, the supposed storm had not materialized. The ships set out a day late. By the time they reached the Mediterranean, the North African garrison they were meant to resupply had run out of vital medicine. The delay cost time the front could not afford. No one blamed the forecasters, but the question lingered: how could a storm appear and vanish on paper while never existing in reality? At the same time, another convoy further north ignored a different alert, believing it to be another phantom warning. That one proved genuine. The ships faced powerful winds and waves that scattered them across the Atlantic. Crews spent days adrift, struggling to regroup. When they finally reached port, their commanders spoke less about the storm and more about their loss of trust. Confidence, once broken, spread like contagion. Commanders who once relied on weather forecasts now demanded second opinions from multiple sources. Orders were delayed as officers debated which data could be believed. Even among meteorologists, suspicion grew. Every radio report carried the weight of potential deception. For Lieutenant Frost, the consequences were personal. His name appeared on forecasts that had influenced many of those decisions. Though he knew his transmissions were being altered somewhere along the chain, proving it to others was impossible. The tension between certainty and doubt became unbearable. His colleagues in London noticed the change in him. Once precise and composed, he now second-guessed every chart he drew. Major Ruth Brennan observed the same phenomenon across the entire intelligence network. The enemy's goal had never been to destroy ships directly. It was to damage the Allied mind, to make leaders question their systems, their science, and even their own judgment. In that sense, the strategy had already succeeded. The invisible war reached the human heart of command. Weather officers, trained to think in patterns and probabilities, now faced emotional exhaustion. Some began to see deception in every cloud formation. A few refused to sign off on forecasts at all, fearing the consequences of error. The Germans had created something no bomb or torpedo could achieve: collective hesitation. Reports from the Atlantic described the confusion vividly. One ship's captain wrote in his log that his men were at war with the weather itself. Another noted that every horizon now looked like a trick. The sea, once their constant ally, had become an uncertain adversary. In North Africa, officers attempted to reconstruct the cause of the supply delay. The falsified report that halted convoy Meridian had originated from a frequency near the Norwegian coast, the same region Frost and Brennan were now investigating. For the first time, there was a direct connection between the phantom transmissions and a measurable loss of life-saving time. Brennan presented her findings to the Allied Intelligence Committee, framing the issue not as meteorological failure but as psychological warfare. She explained that each false signal, though small, produced a chain reaction. A storm that never existed could delay operations by days. A single correction could appear suspicious, leading to inaction. The enemy didn't need to destroy the convoys. They only needed to make the Allies hesitate long enough for outcomes to shift. The realization changed the nature of Allied planning. From then on, psychological factors were added to weather assessments. Forecasts were no longer treated as objective truth, but as potential tools of manipulation. The line between science and warfare blurred completely. For Frost, the moral weight deepened. He had entered the war believing that knowledge, accurate data, and disciplined analysis could protect lives. Now, that same knowledge had become the battlefield. Each time he calculated a pressure front or wind shift, he wondered how it might be twisted by unseen hands. The toll of the weather war could not be measured in statistics alone. It was seen in delayed decisions, missed opportunities, and the silent erosion of trust that passed from commander to sailor, from sailor to machine, and from machine back to man. By April 1944, Allied leadership recognized that the deception could no longer be ignored. The phantom storms had already reshaped logistics across 2 continents. The question was no longer whether they were real. It was how to stop them without revealing that the Allies had discovered their source. That decision would lead to one of the most secret and complex operations of the war, a counterstrike built not on weapons or ships, but on the very frequencies that carried the enemy's lies. When the scale of the deception became clear, the Allies faced a hard choice. They could expose the German interference and risk a rapid escalation, or they could quietly turn that same deception into a tool against its makers. Major Ruth Brennan argued for the second course. Her plan would be unconventional. It would use the airwaves where the phantom storms had first appeared. It would fight the enemy with information. First, Brennan and Lieutenant Andrew Frost mapped what they already knew. False forecasts followed distinct broadcast patterns. The altered readings clustered along key convoy lanes. The phantom storms used authentic Allied signal structures. That last fact was crucial. The enemy could imitate the network. That meant the Allies could also imitate it, but only if they learned exactly how the Germans were doing it. Frost and Brennan proposed a 3-part strategy. The first part was detection. They needed to locate the sources of the false broadcasts. The second was verification. They had to establish a trusted channel for real weather data. The third was deception, a controlled counter-operation to mislead the German network and lure their observers into revealing their positions. Detection began with triangulation. Stations in Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands would coordinate signal measurements. Each outpost recorded subtle phase shifts, signal strength, and timing differences. Those fragments of data were then combined. When plotted on a chart, they pointed toward likely transmitter locations. The work was slow and tedious. It required patience and absolute secrecy. Verification took a different form. Meteorologists created a secondary layer of checks. Instead of relying on single reports, they used mathematical comparisons across multiple stations. Small checksum values were added to coded summaries. If a message arrived with mismatched values, it could be flagged as suspect. The system was technical, but the idea was simple. Make it harder for an enemy to fake an entire network without holding the same keys. The verification protocol also included human redundancy. Senior forecasters in London began independently cross-checking raw instrument logs from trusted Arctic outposts. That made it possible to identify discrepancies between what a forecaster had sent and what arrived at a convoy's receiver. The goal was not immediate confrontation. It was quiet proof. The most daring element was the deception itself. Brennan did not seek to destroy the German transmitters by force. That would risk alerting the enemy and losing the chance to study them. Instead, she wanted to feed the German network plausible but misleading responses. If German operators believed their interference was working, they would reveal patterns in their timing and routing. Those patterns would provide exact locations. To carry out this plan, the Allies needed mimicry. Technicians at signal units worked to reproduce German broadcast characteristics. They built transmitters that could speak in the same cadence and format. The aim was to send subtle acknowledgments back into the contaminated channels, messages that looked like acceptance of the phantom storms. In effect, the Allies would play along with the deception while watching for any reply that betrayed a human operator or a fixed transmitter. This approach required coordination with cryptographers. Teams at signals intelligence units and code-breaking centers were brought into the loop. They helped design the verification checks and ensured that any false responses could be traced. The work was confidential and compartmented. Only a few commanders knew the full plan. There were risks. If the Germans detected the countermeasure, they might change frequencies, move their equipment, or harden their system against mimicry. Worse, they might feed the Allies false counter-evidence, creating a deeper layer of confusion. Brennan and Frost accepted those risks. They judged that the potential gain outweighed the danger. Parallel to the information campaign, the Allies prepared physical options. Special operations teams stood ready to reach suspected Arctic stations. Reconnaissance flights gathered aerial photographs. Naval units were briefed on covert insertion and retrieval actions. The intent was surgical: capture a station for technical study, not an open assault. Commandos would dismantle transmitters and bring back components that could be analyzed in London. Operational security was paramount. If the Germans became aware that one of their weather stations had been located, they might booby-trap equipment, destroy records, or evacuate personnel. The Allies planned to move at night, with small teams skilled in Arctic survival. Those teams would include technical experts who could identify and preserve broadcast hardware for study. The plan also involved deception at the strategic level. Allied commands delayed public mention of the phantom storms. They tightened operational procedures for ships and air units without revealing the true cause. The purpose was twofold: protect the investigation and prevent enemy countermeasures. To the outside world, the adjustments looked like improved precaution. In reality, they masked a hunt. Brennan emphasized psychological patience. The German scheme relied on the enemy's confidence. If the Germans believed their operation was working, they would repeat methods, patterns, and locations. The Allies would wait for those repetitions. They would not act on impulse. That patience would allow them to collect the technical evidence needed to reverse engineer the deception. Frost's role was technical and precise. He designed the checksum systems and trained field forecasters in the verification protocol. He also prepared to go north with a commando team if needed. He wanted to see the equipment firsthand. Understanding how the broadcasts were generated would be essential to dismantling the network. By early 1944, the counter-strike plan moved from paper to practice. Signal teams began feeding controlled acknowledgments back into contaminated channels. Triangulation fixed likely transmitter zones. Reconnaissance flights over the Arctic provided corroborating imagery. Meanwhile, supply convoys operated under revised verification procedures. Commanders received new guidance on how to interpret conflicting forecasts. At the heart of the operation was a moral calculus. The Allies were prepared to let the deception run in a limited, controlled way to gather proof. That meant accepting short-term risk for long-term gain. It was a strategy that trusted analysis over immediate reaction. It assumed the enemy would remain confident enough to expose itself. The plan also relied on restraint. If a commando raid failed or was discovered, the Germans would accelerate their deception. Brennan and Frost made contingency plans for every outcome. They prepared alternate verification networks and set protocols for rapid extraction of teams. Above all, the counterstrike sought to reclaim truth. The Germans had weaponized doubt. The Allied response would weaponize patience, precision, and secrecy. If successful, it would restore confidence in weather intelligence. That, in turn, would reopen the possibility of large-scale operations that depended on reliable forecasts. The operation was not guaranteed to work. It required technical skill, careful timing, and above all, discipline. Yet it was the only realistic path forward. To regain control of the skies, the Allies would have to fight in the same invisible domain the enemy had chosen, the realm of information. The first tests were set. Signals would be sent. Receivers would listen. Men and machines would watch for the faintest sign of reply. If the Germans answered, their location would be revealed. If they did not, the Allies would continue their patient triangulation and prepare for a direct mission to the Arctic. The counterstrike had begun. It would demand technical precision and moral restraint. It would also require courage of a different kind. The courage to hold a course of secrecy while the world around them grew more uncertain. From the Allied side, the phantom storms looked like mystery and malice. From the German side, the program had a different face. It presented itself as necessity. It claimed to be a way to regain lost access to Atlantic weather data. It promised strategic advantage where conventional assets had failed. The operations technical director was Dr. Wilhelm Decker. He was not a typical officer. He was a trained meteorologist. He had spent years in academic labs and coastal observatories. He believed in measurement and method. He believed that weather obeyed rules. He believed, too, that careful science could serve the nation. Decker's orders changed his work. He moved from recording the sky to shaping how others would read it. Under strict guidelines from higher command, his teams built stations in remote places. Some were manned. Small crews rotated in for months at a time. Others were automated devices left to broadcast on repeat. The stations served two functions. They collected real atmospheric data for German planners. They also replayed altered reports into radio bands the Allies used. The forgeries were subtle. A pressure reading might be changed by a single digit. A wind direction could be shifted by a single degree. These small errors were enough to nudge forecasts off course once those reports were folded into Allied maps. Decker understood the need for subtlety. He knew that crude falsification would be spotted quickly. His broadcasts had to resemble genuine signals. That required a deep study of Allied formats. His teams reverse-engineered the cadence, the headers, and the typical phrasing found in Allied weather summaries. Then they built devices that could imitate them. The work demanded technical skill and secrecy. Transmitters were calibrated to match Allied signal strength. Timings were adjusted to fit existing broadcast cycles. The aim was not to overwhelm the neighbor, but to whisper into their ear. The deception targeted confidence more than hardware. Inside the Norwegian facility, tension grew as the program expanded. Decker kept careful notes. His logbooks recorded successes and unexpected echoes. He noted when Allied convoys altered course. He logged when a false alert led to delays at a depot. Those entries were data points. They confirmed his design. They also deepened his unease. He was not blind to consequences. Some in his circle spoke proudly of the campaign. Others avoided talk of the human cost. Decker thought in probabilities and outcomes. He recorded how information shifted decisions. He watched how commanders delayed or accelerated plans based on reports that might not be true. As the operation proved effective, pressure followed. Military leaders asked for larger effects. They wanted forecasts that would force major decisions, not just small errors. Decker resisted extreme falsification. He believed that implausible reports would eventually betray the scheme. The success of the operation depended on its plausibility. That view placed him at odds with authority. Superiors urged bolder action. They saw the operation as a lever to tilt entire campaigns. Decker argued for restraint. He insisted that the broadcasts remain just plausible enough to be believed, and just false enough to cause misdirected decisions. The work also revealed unexpected feedback. Some of the automated stations picked up return signals. Those echoes suggested someone was listening and possibly tracing transmissions. Decker suspected Allied technicians were studying signal timing and phase shifts. If triangulation was possible, the station locations could be found. To counter that risk, teams adjusted their schedules. Transmitters were moved, or their timing altered. Field teams tested new ways to mask source signatures. Decker oversaw experiments in signal masking and relay. His engineers rewired antennas and rerouted power to vary the broadcast footprint. At times, he felt like a scientist, trapped inside military strategy. He kept notebooks in which he recorded a line that later surfaced in post-war interviews. When facts become tools, the discipline that produces them is diminished. He meant that the pursuit of truth could be corrupted by purpose. He meant that a method could be used to create doubt. Decker's personal conflict deepened as he watched the effects of his broadcasts. He found maps in which supply lines were broken by phantom storms. He read reports of delayed convoys and of wounded morale. He began to question whether the strategic gain justified the erosion of trust that his work caused. Yet he did not stop. The system depended on him. His technical skill was central to keeping falsified data plausible. He also feared suspicion from his own side. To admit failure could mean disgrace or worse. He walked a tight line between duty and doubt. Within the operation, discipline ruled. Teams rotated on strict schedules. Secure courier routes brought components and spare parts to remote posts. Arctic crews lived under orders designed to minimize contact with local populations. Each station was an island of secrecy, cut off from normal civilian life. Decker maintained careful control over his notes. He limited the number of people who knew both the scientific and deceptive aspects. He wanted to protect the method from exposure. He also wanted, secretly, to keep the possibility of stopping if the moral cost became too high. As spring approached, Decker's unease grew. Allied analysts had begun to triangulate suspicious signals. Reports suggested that technicians were closing in on source areas. Decker altered broadcast patterns to confuse triangulation. He shifted frequencies and introduced deliberate noise. Those moves bought time, but they also forced heavier manipulation to achieve the same effect. The heavier the manipulation, the less plausible the reports became. Decker saw the dangerous curve. He understood that success required balance. Too little deception, and the operation failed. Too much, and it would collapse under its own implausibility. In private, he wrote a note that folded into a notebook. Science must not become an instrument of bewilderment. It was both a plea and a warning. He had entered the work believing he served a national need. He now saw the ethical fracture that came when truth itself became an instrument. Still, orders were orders. The High Command wanted results. Decker continued to calibrate and broadcast. He continued to monitor the effects. He continued to record echoes that might point to Allied tracing. Unseen to him, Allied technicians were indeed watching. They were mapping phase shifts and noting timing anomalies. They were learning how the broadcasts were generated. They were preparing to respond. The German operation had reached a critical point. It had demonstrated a new method of influence. It had also created traces that could be followed. In trying to keep control of the airwaves, Decker's network had left a trail. The same discipline that made the deception possible had produced the clues that might expose it. Inside the Norwegian command post, Decker faced a narrowing choice. Keep refining the deception and risk total exposure, or scale back and risk allowing the Allies to recover weather confidence. He could not know which course would preserve more lives, or which would serve history more honestly. Outside, the Arctic signals kept moving across the ocean. Within those invisible waves, a new confrontation was forming. It would be decided not by weapons, but by code, timing, and human resolve. By March 1944, the Allied counter-operation entered its decisive stage. Triangulation from multiple weather outposts had narrowed the source of the phantom broadcasts to a chain of islands deep within the Arctic Circle. The signals were strongest near Spitsbergen, a frozen archipelago north of Norway, long used by both sides as a forward observation point. Major Ruth Brennan authorized a joint British-Norwegian expedition to confirm the source. The mission would operate under the cover of a meteorological survey. Officially, it was a scientific field inspection. In reality, it was a hunt for the heart of the German weather deception network. Lieutenant Andrew Frost was attached as a technical advisor. His experience with radio calibration and atmospheric readings made him indispensable. For months he had studied the signals from a distance. Now he would confront the machinery behind them face to face. He understood the risk. The Arctic was more hostile than any battlefield, and every hour in its cold meant danger, not only from the enemy, but from nature itself. The team consisted of a small unit of commandos and technical specialists, transported by a Norwegian vessel that had been refitted for stealth. There was no intention to fight unless forced. Their purpose was examination and capture. Brennan's order was clear: bring back proof, not destruction. The voyage north lasted days. The crew operated under constant silence, avoiding radio contact. Each night, Frost studied the instruments aboard, confirming that the phantom transmissions were still active and growing stronger the farther north they traveled. When the readings finally peaked, he marked the coordinates. They matched the estimates from London exactly. At dawn, the commandos came ashore on a remote inlet of Spitsbergen Island. There was no sign of life, only wind, rock, and the endless snow. Following the radio readings, they found what they were looking for within hours. Hidden inside a hollow in the ice was a compact steel structure. At first glance, it looked like ordinary meteorological equipment. Closer inspection revealed something far more complex. The station was fully automated, powered by long-duration batteries, and designed for months of unattended operation. Antennas extended upward through carefully carved tunnels in the ice. Inside the main compartment, transmitters and sensors connected through a tangle of wires, meters, and code wheels. The equipment was still active. A soft hum pulsed through the chamber, the sound of an ongoing broadcast. Frost examined the components with silent concentration. The machinery was sophisticated beyond expectation. The transmitter was capable of duplicating Allied radio cadence and frequency patterns with near perfection. Even more alarming, it could replay stored segments of genuine Allied weather traffic. That meant the deception was not purely random. It was intelligent imitation, built on recorded truth. Among the equipment, Frost found a log cylinder, a rotating drum etched with data sequences. It contained both authentic and falsified measurements, carefully interwoven. Each line of false data had been calculated to appear statistically possible, yet divergent enough to distort predictions. The precision struck him as chilling. This was not reckless tampering. It was methodical science turned against itself. The commandos photographed every angle and began dismantling the structure for transport. They recovered samples of the encoded cylinders, spare parts, and handwritten notes left by previous operators. There were no signs of human presence now, only traces of earlier habitation. It was likely that the station had been installed during the previous autumn and left to run autonomously. When Frost powered down the transmitter, the silence felt strange, almost unnatural. For months, those signals had shaped Allied forecasts. With one switch, the stream of deception stopped. He noted the final coordinates and transmitted them by coded message to London. Brennan's team received the confirmation hours later. The first proof of the German weather warfare network had been captured intact. But Frost's sense of accomplishment was mixed with unease. The design of the station suggested a wider system. The precision of its components implied central coordination. He realized that this single device was not the source of the deception, but one node in a much larger web. Each station likely reinforced others, broadcasting in overlapping sequences to make the false signals seem genuine. While the team loaded the captured hardware onto their vessel, Frost examined the equipment again. A small calibration panel contained timing intervals labeled in German shorthand. When he aligned them with known Allied signal cycles, the truth became clear. The German network had mirrored Allied schedules perfectly. Every false report was timed to blend seamlessly into existing transmissions. Back in London, analysts would later confirm that these stations operated under direct supervision from a command center in occupied Norway, the very one run by Dr. Wilhelm Decker. That revelation explained the consistent technical quality across different transmissions. The return journey south was slower and more dangerous. Ice conditions worsened, and communication was limited to coded bursts. Frost spent the passage documenting everything he had observed: component types, signal strengths, and the structure of the code wheels. He knew the data would help design future countermeasures. Upon arrival in Scotland, the recovered equipment was sent immediately to Allied intelligence laboratories. Experts confirmed Frost's suspicions. The transmitter's output pattern was identical to the phantom storms recorded in previous months. The code wheels revealed a repeating substitution cipher based on barometric ranges. It was primitive by cryptographic standards, but remarkably effective against automated Allied decoding systems. The findings shocked the intelligence community. The Germans had built a network capable of distorting not just one signal, but entire regional forecasts. With multiple synchronized stations, they could alter the perceived weather picture across thousands of miles. It was psychological warfare on a scientific foundation. The captured logs also revealed another detail: references to transmissions labeled Nordlicht and Izmir. Cross-referencing these with intercepted traffic confirmed two additional, suspected stations further east, possibly still operational. Brennan ordered immediate reconnaissance flights to confirm their existence. The Arctic raid became a quiet success, known only to a few within high command. Frost's report described the operation not as a military victory, but as a revelation. He wrote that the Germans had achieved what no army had done before. They had made nature appear untrustworthy. By manipulating information about weather, they had attacked the human mind's reliance on order. For the first time, the Allies possessed proof that the war for truth had a physical form: machines buried in ice, transmitting confusion across the sky. The psychological impact on Allied leadership was profound. The deception was no longer theoretical. It was a tangible weapon. The need to dismantle the remaining network became urgent. Plans were drawn for follow-up operations against other suspected sites. Frost was assigned to coordinate the technical aspects. Brennan, meanwhile, prepared the second phase of her strategy, turning the captured data into a trap. The Arctic hunt had revealed the mechanism behind the phantom storms. The next step would be to reverse the current, to make the enemy's weapon turn upon itself. The raid on Spitsbergen had given the Allies what they needed: proof that the phantom storms were not a coincidence, but the result of a calculated system. Yet proof alone could not stop it. The German network was still active, still transmitting. Some stations were automated, others mobile, and their reach stretched from Norway to the Arctic seas. Destroying them one by one would take months the Allies did not have. Major Ruth Brennan proposed a faster, more strategic response. Instead of dismantling the network, they would infiltrate it. The Germans believed their operation remained undiscovered. That belief was the Allies' greatest weapon. Brennan called her plan the Deception Web. Its purpose was not to silence the enemy broadcasts, but to reshape the information flow so that German operators would begin to act on their own falsehoods. Using the captured code wheels and timing charts from Spitsbergen, cryptographers at Bletchley Park reconstructed the German broadcast algorithms. They discovered that the weather deception relied on a limited set of variations, a repeating pattern of altered readings that cycled every 10 days. By predicting those cycles, Allied intelligence could anticipate where the next phantom storms would appear. That knowledge became the foundation for counter-control. Frost led the technical component of the plan. His first task was to rebuild the compromised network into two layers, one clean, one contaminated. The clean network would handle verified data through new checksum codes and mathematical identifiers. The contaminated network, however, would be left deliberately open. Into that space, the Allies began to send selective false acknowledgements. Each message confirmed the existence of phantom storms that the Germans believed they had successfully fabricated. It was deception, layered within deception, a mirror game designed to make the originators of confusion trust their own lies. Allied signal operators, trained in mimicry, transmitted short responses across compromised frequencies. The messages sounded like routine meteorological traffic. Each confirmed that Allied fleets were delaying or diverting because of the phantom storms. The intent was to reinforce German confidence. Every false confirmation would make the Germans believe their weather warfare was working perfectly. Meanwhile, Frost's clean network ran in secret, secured by the new verification system. This second layer connected only trusted stations using a mathematical sequence that no German system could reproduce. Every real forecast for upcoming operations, including the weather predictions needed for the approaching invasion of France, would come through that hidden channel. The results were immediate. Within weeks, German operators increased their false transmissions, believing they had achieved total control over Allied forecasting. Decker's headquarters in Norway reported a surge in favorable outcomes. Allied ships appeared to obey their phantom warnings. The German command, unaware of the counter-deception, began making its own decisions based on the same falsified data. The psychological balance of the weather war had shifted. The deceiver was now the deceived. Brennan coordinated closely with cryptographers and naval intelligence officers. Every false German broadcast was logged, analyzed, and exploited. When the enemy predicted storms that did not exist, Allied planners used those gaps to move convoys through safe waters. When they reported calm seas in regions known to be dangerous, the Allies interpreted the contradiction as proof that the deception had been turned inward. In April 1944, a significant test came. German transmissions warned of heavy weather forming along the Bay of Biscay. The altered reports suggested that conditions would make air operations impossible. The Allies, using Frost's clean data, knew the skies would be clear. They authorized a major reconnaissance mission over western France. The operation proceeded flawlessly. German observers, receiving no aircraft sightings, assumed their false storm reports had grounded Allied planes. They congratulated themselves for another success. For Brennan, the victory was strategic rather than tactical. The Germans had crossed the invisible threshold where deception began to consume itself. Every move they made to reinforce the illusion only confirmed to the Allies that the counter-operation was succeeding. To maintain the illusion, Frost and his team carefully timed their acknowledgments. They sent just enough confirmation to suggest human reaction, but avoided over-communication. The Germans had to believe the Allies were still operating normally, confused, reactive, and dependent on corrupted forecasts. The trick was balance. Too little response would raise suspicion. Too much would reveal control. In London, Brennan presented weekly intelligence summaries. They showed how German weather interference had peaked and then plateaued. The trend lines revealed a clear shift. The Germans believed their operation was achieving maximum effect. In truth, their false reports were now guiding only themselves. The operation required strict secrecy within the Allied network. Only a small circle of officers knew the full structure of the deception web. To most meteorological stations, the new verification codes were simply a technical upgrade. Even among field commanders, few understood the psychological battle unfolding behind their daily forecasts. Bletchley Park played a quiet but decisive role. Analysts there confirmed that the German messages now contained increasing self-reference. Decker's operators were modifying their output in response to the very feedback the Allies had planted. It was a feedback loop of misinformation, one that turned the entire system inward, distorting its own perception of truth. By late May, As preparations for the European invasion accelerated, Frost's verification network was the only trusted source for operational forecasts. Brennan's deception web continued to feed misleading echoes across the contaminated channels. German meteorological intelligence, once a weapon, had become a liability. The irony was profound. The more carefully Decker adjusted his broadcasts to mislead the Allies, the more deeply he fell into the Allies' trap. His own trust in data, the foundation of his scientific career, became the instrument of his undoing. For Frost, the success carried a different weight. Each day he reviewed the weather maps and saw how closely they aligned with the clean data. He knew the deception had saved lives, but he also understood what it meant. They had become deceivers themselves. To win, they had to embrace the same ambiguity they had fought to expose. In her final briefing before the next phase, Brennan summarized it in plain terms. The Germans had built a maze of mirrors. The Allies had simply turned the mirrors around. As the calendar turned toward June, one question remained. Would this invisible war, fought with signals and trust, hold long enough for the invasion to begin? The coming days would test every forecast, every checksum, and every ounce of human belief in the unseen. The deception web had done its work. Now the real weather and the real war would decide what came next. In late May 1944, the weather war reached its breaking point. Inside a quiet facility near Tromsø, Dr. Wilhelm Decker reviewed a series of Allied responses that did not fit any pattern he had seen before. Ships that should have delayed their movements during phantom storms were sailing without hesitation. Air squadrons that should have been grounded were active over regions marked as hazardous. The data refused to obey his expectations. At first, he suspected technical error. One of the automated transmitters might have gone out of synchronization. He ordered recalibration, checking signal logs against his forecast schedules. The transmissions appeared normal. Frequencies aligned perfectly. Timing intervals were correct. And yet, the outcomes made no sense. It was as if the enemy already knew which storms were false. For months, Decker's deception network had operated with near-mechanical precision. Each false report was designed to create subtle distortion, guiding the Allied fleet into uncertainty. But now, the rhythm had changed. Convoys moved in defiance of false warnings. Operations continued during supposed high winds. Even when he adjusted the deception patterns, the Allies behaved unpredictably. He examined the feedback loops his team maintained, intercepted fragments of Allied weather chatter. Bits of data returned from captured signals. Something was off. The fragments no longer carried confusion. They carried consistency. Someone had tightened the Allied network, sealed it, and perhaps even used his own transmissions as bait. Decker's staff suggested the enemy had improved their verification systems. He knew this was more than improvement. It was inversion. Somewhere along the line, the deception had turned back toward its source. The phantom storms were still broadcasting, but their echoes had changed shape. For the first time since the operation began, Decker felt uncertainty. He reviewed each of his station's reports, mapping results against convoy routes. The correlation that once confirmed success was gone. Ships no longer changed course in reaction to phantom warnings. Some had begun to exploit the false forecasts, sailing precisely through areas that his reports had labeled dangerous. He noted it in his private journal. The enemy behaves as though the storms are known illusions. The possibility of exposure hung over him. If the Allies had discovered the deception, the consequences would be immediate. German command would demand answers. To admit failure in an operation of this secrecy would be seen not as a scientific mistake, but as disloyalty. Decker faced a choice: reveal the potential compromise, or hide it and hope the illusion still held in some areas. He weighed both paths carefully. Reporting a breach would risk dismantling the network he had built from nothing. Concealing it risked allowing the deception to collapse under its own contradictions. The moral weight pressed heavily on him. What had begun as scientific necessity now felt like a trap of his own design. He had tried to maintain precision within deception, but precision had betrayed him. Truth had found its way through falsehood. Across the Norwegian coast, signals from other stations echoed the same irregularities. Broadcast intervals failed to align. Weather readings no longer matched field reports. When plotted on a chart, the inconsistencies formed a pattern he could not ignore. The error was systematic, not random. Someone was manipulating the manipulation. Decker's subordinates grew uneasy. One of his engineers remarked that their own instruments might have been compromised by Allied mimicry. Decker did not dismiss it. The enemy had resources, intelligence, and time. If they had learned to mirror his frequencies, they could easily create false responses designed to feed his network disinformation. The irony cut deeply. His own creation was now being used against him. Within days, his doubts became reality. Reports from German Naval Command mentioned that recent forecasts from his network had proven disastrously inaccurate. Submarines had surfaced in regions of high wind where none was expected. Supply ships had sailed into real storms after relying on calm predictions. The leadership wanted explanations. Decker stayed silent. He avoided written correspondence and limited direct radio communication, fearing interception. But silence brought its own danger. Without new data, command might assume sabotage or incompetence. He began drafting a private report, a technical account of the likely causes, filled with neutral language and scientific detail. Yet every sentence felt like an admission. As he wrote, his thoughts drifted to the Allied meteorologists he had sought to deceive. He imagined them working late in underground rooms, tracing signals as he once had. In them, he saw the mirror of his own pursuit. Order amid confusion, clarity within noise. The more he considered it, the more he understood that the war had become not a battle of nations, but a struggle over who could define reality itself. On the night of May 27th, he reviewed intercepted Allied communications one last time. The transmissions were clean, organized, confident. No trace of interference appeared. For the first time in months, the enemy's network sounded uncorrupted. That realization told him everything. His system had been compromised entirely. He made a final note in his log. The deception has reversed direction. What we broadcast now returns distorted by the enemy's will. They no longer follow our storms. They create their own clarity. He knew the message would never reach Berlin intact. He did not send it. Instead, he ordered his operators to maintain standard procedure. No one was to change frequencies or stop broadcasting. If the Allies were indeed watching, they would see continuity and assume control. It was a small act of defiance, perhaps also resignation. He would let the deception die naturally, without spectacle. In the days that followed, German intelligence continued to act on weather reports that no longer reflected truth. Air patrols were grounded unnecessarily. Naval units delayed deployment. The falsehoods once aimed outward now weakened their own chain of command. The German high command did not know it, but their meteorological network, once a sharp instrument of psychological warfare, had turned inward, dull and self-destructive. Every false reading Decker had created now echoed back as a real consequence for his own side. Far away in London, Frost and Brennan read intercepted traffic, confirming the shift. German transmissions carried subtle signs of panic and self-correction. The deception web had worked. For Decker, isolation deepened. The scientist who had once believed in control now faced the collapse of his creation. He understood that deception, when carried too far, consumes its maker. In a private notebook, he recorded one final line. "We wanted to command the weather. Instead, we have lost command of reason." By early June, his operation existed only in fragments. The broadcasts continued, but their influence was gone. The phantom storms had lost their audience. The weather itself was turning. Across the channel, Allied meteorologists prepared to read it one last time, with truth, precision, and faith restored. The breaking point had come. The deception war was ending, and its final measure would be the weather over Normandy. In the first days of June 1944, the question of weather determined the future of the war. Every hour, Allied meteorologists gathered in cramped, dimly lit rooms across Britain to study readings from the newly secured network. Each report carried a single purpose: to decide when the largest invasion in modern history could begin. Lieutenant Andrew Frost was among them. Months of work had led to this moment, rebuilding trust in the weather data after months of deception. The new verification system had stabilized forecasts, and for the first time in more than a year, the Allied command could depend on what they read. Yet the sky itself seemed uncertain. Low pressure was forming over the Atlantic, moving east. The invasion required a narrow window of calm seas and manageable winds. The tides, moon, and light had to align perfectly. A single miscalculation could strand thousands of men before they even reached the French coast. In London, Group Captain James Stagg, the chief meteorologist advising General Eisenhower, chaired the forecasting team. Frost's verified data fed directly into those assessments. Each update was cross-checked through the clean channel that Brennan's deception web had preserved. The ghost signals still existed, but they were now powerless, drifting through the airwaves unheard and unused. Across the channel, German command worked under a very different picture. Their forecasts, drawn from the same compromised network Decker had built, painted an image of continuous storms. Reports from Norway and Denmark warned of high winds and dangerous seas. Field commanders believed that no invasion could possibly take place under such conditions. Some units in Normandy even released men from duty for routine maintenance. Others reduced patrols. The deception had come full circle. On the evening of June 3rd, weather conditions appeared marginal. The Allied invasion fleet was assembled and ready, but winds across the channel were rising. Frost's network confirmed that the storm would intensify through June 4th and ease briefly after. That small gap, a single day of relative calm, became the critical opportunity. If the invasion were delayed beyond it, the tides would not align again for weeks. The forecast meeting on June 4th was tense. The storm outside rattled the windows of the Southwick House headquarters. Reports arrived from ships and aircraft struggling in rough seas. Yet Frost's clean data held steady. The pressure would rise, the winds would calm, and a break would come by dawn on June 6th. It was a narrow window, but it was real. General Eisenhower made his decision based on that forecast. The invasion would proceed. In Norway, Decker's remaining stations transmitted their latest data to Berlin. Their charts predicted continuous gales across the channel and heavy cloud cover over northern France. German meteorologists concluded that no major Allied operation was possible for at least 2 days. Their commanders accepted those readings without question. The very network they had designed to deceive had now deceived them. On June 5th, the Allied fleet began its approach under rain and strong winds. The seas were rough, but within the limits the forecast had predicted. Every sailor aboard knew the operation depended on the weather holding just long enough. Frost's equations had become the invisible compass guiding an entire army. Throughout that night, teams at Allied weather stations monitored every change in the barometer. Frost stood beside the communications console, recording data in real time. The winds eased exactly as predicted. The clean network had not failed. Nature itself seemed to pause, long enough for the invasion to begin. At dawn on June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy. The sea was unsettled but navigable. The sky was overcast but clear enough for aircraft to support the assault. German forces, still expecting days of storms, were caught unprepared. Many coastal batteries remained unmanned or under partial readiness. Conflicting reports from Decker's compromised network further delayed their response. Some commands received warnings of impossible weather events, while others reported calm conditions. Confusion spread through the German chain of command faster than the news of the invasion itself. In London, Brennan received confirmation that the first waves had reached shore. The operation's timing, decided on the strength of the restored forecast, had succeeded. For the first time since the phantom storms began, the weather had become an ally once more. The contrast between the two sides was stark. The Allies had built a network of verification, layered with trust and precision. The Germans were trapped within their own falsehoods, unable to separate reality from illusion. The weapon of psychological warfare had turned against its makers. By midday, reports from the front confirmed that the deception web had achieved what no direct attack could have done. It had neutralized the enemy's awareness. German commanders received so many conflicting signals that they could not act decisively. Their coastal defenses remained disorganized during the critical first hours of the landings. For Frost, the success brought little celebration. The victory was scientific, yes, but it carried a human cost that could not be ignored. He thought of Decker, a man he had never met, but whose fingerprints he now recognized in every corrupted data stream. The two of them had fought the same war from opposite ends of the spectrum, one to distort, one to restore. The irony was undeniable. The operation had proven that information itself could decide battles, but it also showed how fragile truth could become when science was turned into strategy. Frost had helped reverse the deception, but he knew how easily the roles could have been reversed again. As the invasion unfolded, Allied command issued a single message across the secure channel: proceeding under predicted conditions. Those words, dry and technical, carried the weight of an entire campaign and the silent triumph of every analyst, forecaster, and technician who had fought the invisible war above the clouds. By nightfall, the beachheads were secure. The weather window had closed soon after, with heavy storms returning on June 7th. Had the invasion been delayed even a single day, the outcome might have been different. In Norway, Decker received word of the landings. For a moment, he refused to believe it. His reports had predicted storms. His instruments had confirmed them. But when field reconnaissance contradicted every line of his charts, he understood. The deception he had created was no longer his. It had been absorbed, mirrored, and finally turned back. He recorded one last entry before his station fell silent. They trusted the sky, and the sky obeyed them. We trusted our instruments, and they betrayed us. That night, as the winds rose again over the channel, Frost stood at his post in silence. The storm outside no longer mattered. For once, the chaos of nature had favored truth. The invasion had succeeded not through domination of the weather, but through the restoration of trust in it. And that trust, rebuilt in secrecy, tested in deception, had changed the course of the war. After the Normandy landings, the truth about the phantom storms slowly came to light. What had begun as invisible warfare through radio waves ended as one of the most remarkable intelligence turnarounds of the conflict. In the weeks following D-Day, Allied analysts pieced together the results of the weather deception campaign. Records showed that the Germans had continued to rely on falsified forecasts long after their network had been compromised. The same false data that once misled Allied convoys now guided German naval movements into real storms. Supply ships were delayed, and air patrols were grounded when skies were clear. Lieutenant Andrew Frost completed a detailed report for combined operations. It concluded that the enemy's psychological weather warfare had collapsed under its own design. The manipulation of meteorological data, once a strategic advantage, had become a self-inflicted wound. Major Ruth Brennan added her own assessment. Trust, once corrupted, cannot be restored by those who created the corruption. It can only be rebuilt by those who still believe in truth. The captured weather station from Spitsbergen was studied extensively. Its components provided insight into how scientific precision had been twisted into deception. The findings confirmed that the Germans' greatest strength, their attention to technical detail, had become their downfall. In trying to control uncertainty, they had overreached. By late summer, Allied forces advancing through France uncovered additional automated weather units. Each bore the same construction marks, the same code wheels, and the same flawed logic. When confronted with evidence of the network's collapse, Captured German officers admitted that their command had lost confidence in the data months earlier but continued to use it for lack of alternatives. Dr. Wilhelm E. Decker was captured later that year in Norway after the German withdrawal. In debriefings, he described his operation as a scientific necessity turned moral mistake. He explained that the purpose had never been to manipulate nature, but to manipulate human perception. His statement echoed the central truth of the entire campaign. The battle had never been for control of weather, but for control of belief. Frost met Brennan one final time that summer to close the file. Both understood that their victory was not one of destruction, but of endurance. They had preserved something intangible, faith in information. It had come at a cost measured not in ships or bombs, but in the erosion of certainty that war always demands. The report on the phantom storms remained classified for decades. Few would ever know how close the Allied invasion came to being delayed or misdirected by invisible hands. But among those who did, the lesson was clear. Truth can survive deception only when guarded by discipline, humility, and doubt in the right measure. By autumn, as Europe turned toward liberation, the echoes of that strange weather war faded into history. The airwaves were quiet again, but those who had fought in that unseen conflict, scientists, cryptographers, and forecasters, understood that they had witnessed the future of warfare, a world where information itself could wound or heal, depending on who controlled it.